We are so grateful that you are joining us this evening for a special anti-racism training in our anti-racism series. Tonight we have Reverend Sandhya Jha from the Oakland Peace Center and an author and Disciples of Christ minister, and she's going to be sharing a new program she's put together on what does it take on the system, confronting systemic racism together. This program will be recorded and we'll be sharing this on our YouTube channel at the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County. And so if you're not able to stay um, for the whole training tonight, you're welcome to join us there. And I want to welcome Reverend Sandhya Jha, and she's going to give us some basics as we get started.
Friends, it is so good to be with you. I've been a fan of I4C for many years and have done some work with y'all over the years with some housing justice work I did when I was with East Bay Housing Organizations and working alongside Reverend Deb Lee. We did some faith and justice trainings that I know some of you from. I'm just really grateful for who you are in the community, and I'm really grateful to get to be with you for this conversation. So thank you. And I know a couple of you are reading my book in one of the I4C congregations. So you'll recognize some of this content because you just read chapter 3. So when we get to the definition, you'll be like, I know that stuff already. You'll be ahead of the rest of the group. So let's go ahead and, if you don't mind, Will, getting the PowerPoint started.
And do you want to have questions in the chat room, or should
Oh,
folks
yeah.
just unmute themselves? How would you like to keep the conversation flowing as you are also doing your presentation tonight?
Yeah, so I think there'll be a couple of places where I pause and get input from y'all rather than just going through the whole thing. So you can jot them in the chat box, but I might not see them till we get to a pause. And when we get to a pause, you can also ask them out loud. So let's go ahead and skip to the next slide. So I wanted to invite you into this space based on a quote I really love by an Aboriginal activist who said, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time, but if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And the reason Leela Watson said that is she said, very often people show up for racial justice work to help somebody else out. But one of the things we'll be talking about today is that systemic racism does damage to us all, and I hope that we're all showing up for our own liberation as well as for each other's. So we can go to the next slide. So we all have stories. I think our stories are really important. It's a really central part of the work I do around racial justice is giving us all the space to connect with our stories. And so my story is illustrated in this photograph. You'll see my mother on the left. That's me as a baby, and that's my father on the right before we came to this country. So my mother is from a tiny island off the coast of Scotland. She still has that adorable accent. My father came from a small village in India near the border of Bangladesh. And uh, their story is one of those true love transcends culture and religion. I was raised in an interfaith house. My father was Hindu. All of my family in India are Hindu. My mother's Scottish Presbyterian. I was raised, and he came from a village that was 80% Muslim. So I was raised very much with a sense of the value of the divine that shows up across our different traditions. And that's a beautiful part of our story. The other thing about that picture is that it reminds me that when my parents tried to buy their first home in England, there was a petition circulated to try to stop them from moving in because the neighbors were afraid of miscegenated babies showing up in the neighborhood. But look how cute that miscegenated baby is. So that's part of the story too. Our stories are complicated, and our stories, when they interweave with the way race has been constructed, are even more complicated. Go ahead and move to the next slide. Oh, right. I skipped a slide, I apologize. So I wanted to ground us in a definition because the thing about racism as a term, and yes, when I say miscegenated, that's a term that means mixed race. It's a negative term, it's a derogatory term that was used to stop interracial marriage because the fear was miscegenated babies. Babies who were mixed race, which is the worst thing you could possibly imagine. That's what the term I was referencing. All of the laws against mixed marriage use that term of miscegenation. So part of the reason our stories are complicated is because of the way that racism has been constructed, both in this country and in different ways across the globe. But I'm going to focus for our conversation today on how racism functions specifically in the United States. And a definition that sociologists use, that anti-racism trainers use, that lots of community organizations use, that if you've read either the book White Fragility or Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, you'll have come across this definition. And just this year, it was added to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And that definition is distinct from the way racism is often used in common parlance. If you're reading a newspaper article or you're watching the TV, they might use racism and race prejudice as if those are the same thing. The definition we're using is, and go ahead and click forward, is race prejudice plus institutional and systemic power. And very briefly, I'm going to take us through each of those words. So let's go ahead and move forward on that slide one time. So starting with the word prejudice, actually, go ahead and take us out of the screen share function for a second. And let me go ahead and ask the group, when you hear the term prejudice, what do you think of? And I promise it's not even a trick question. You can just unmute yourself and tell me what you think.
Hatred.
Hatred.
Separation. Good,
Separation.
bad, right, wrong.
Oh yeah, binaries, huh?
Bias.
Bias.
Being afraid of the other.
Being afraid of the other.
Lack of opportunity.
Lack of opportunity.
Prejudging.
Prejudging. That's it. All of those other words are all the result of that basic thing, which is judging without information, right? We're taught to prejudge. The example I use, especially around this time of year, is most parents teach their kids not to take candy from strangers. That's prejudging all strangers. Most strangers are fine. Their candy's probably fine. But we tell our kids for good reason, don't take candy from strangers. The thing about prejudging is that it blinds us to the potential good of a lot of people. It also, and forgive me for using that term, but it also causes us not to notice the dangers within our own community, right? So we tell our children not to take candy from strangers, but most of the harm that happens to children, the kind we're trying to protect them from, happens at the hands of people they know. So prejudging stops us from recognizing the gifts of strangers. It also stops us from recognizing the dangers within our own community. Let's jump back into the slide presentation, Will, and I promise not to do that to you too often. Thanks for indulging me on that. I just wanted to give us a chance to see each other and hear each other's voices. So the next word I want us to look at is race. And Normally, I would have us spend some time talking about what we think race is, but I'm going to cheat and give you the actual answer because there are lots of ways that we could talk about it. And race, I think many of us know that our DNA across diverse cultures is more similar than it is different, that almost all people are just people. We have the same DNA, we have the same biology running, we have the same blood running through our veins. And so when we talk about race, we talk about it as what they call a social construct. And all that means is it was intentionally created as a specific narrative. It's not biologically true, and yet it still affects us in profound ways. And to get at that, I have a whole training I do that is like an hour and a half going through US history and how race was constructed in very specific ways in this country. But in an hour and a half, I don't do as good a job as this 7-minute or 10-minute video does. So if you'll bear with me, let's watch this video, What is the Origin of Race? And even if you're really familiar with this subject, I hope you'll pick up a new thing or two. I do every time I watch it.
Did you know that race was not always considered a biological or genetic category? So how did we come to understand it that way today? We all have a working definition of race. Whether you kinda understand it, hate it, claim not to see it, or study it, hint hint, cough cough, that's me, it still plays a role in all of our daily lives. From the way that people interact to the places they live and stereotypes they face, race is still a determining factor in our social structures, both inside and outside of the US. But full disclosure, I do a lot of US history, so this is a US specific video about race, since these histories operate differently across various contexts. Okay, so let's get started by asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race? Well, before we started thinking of race along the lines of biology, genetics, or phenotype, aka physical appearance, did you know that it was largely considered a category of kinship or group affiliation? In the 16th century, we started to see the use of the word race in English, but it isn't attributed to physical traits or behavior. It meant quite literally that you were all members of the same household, group, or shared a common ancestor. But when did race shift to being less about kinship groups to sounding more complicated than the lyrics to I'm My Own Grandpa? Well, we can see that starting in the colonial era. And that brings us to our second question. Why did we see the shift in the idea of race in the 17th and 18th century? The answer to this question is firmly rooted in two things: the rise of global capitalism that was backed by slavery and colonialism, and a period of theorizations in Europe known as the Enlightenment. When the Spanish began the colonization of the Caribbean and later Latin America after 1492, they looked to native populations to mine silver and gold under brutal working conditions. They set about enslaving, attacking, and murdering those who didn't comply. Thousands of native people died as a result of overwork, genocide, or because they were exposed to new diseases brought over with the Spanish settlers. And when England established its first successful long-term colonies in North America in Virginia in 1607, they looked to mirror this pattern of enslavement with native people, while also seeking copious amounts of silver and gold. But they had limited success with this route because, one, Virginia wasn't exactly rich in gold, and two, native populations were able to resist the efforts of early settlers through fighting back or escaping and blending into adjacent native groups. English settlers still wanted to make money off of this venture, so they began to look to alternative ways of making Virginia profitable, and that came in the form of tobacco. But a major problem with growing tobacco is that it requires a ton of labor, and the laborers needed the agricultural skills to turn the crop into cash. Because they had already met with sustained resistance from native populations, English settlers looked to other potential labor sources: enslaved Africans and indentured British laborers. There are some important distinctions to make between these two groups. First, indenture was a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. Some indentured servants were brought to the colonies against their will, either as a punishment or because they were children. Terms of these contracts were often very exploitative, but many came willingly in exchange for their passage to the new colonies. And many of these indentured servants finished the terms of their contracts and began lives as property owners. Enslavement of Africans was an entirely different category of labor from indenture, because 1, slavery was for life, not for a fixed term or a number of years. 2, slaves were not considered human. 3, it was not a contract because it takes 2 consenting humans to enter into a contract. And 4, slave laws were enacted codifying hereditary slavery, meaning that if you were enslaved and had children, then those children would also remain in slavery. With the expansion of this system, there was understandably some resistance, even from Europeans. So in order to continue to justify slavery, we start to see the pseudoscience of race emerge that connected physical features, behavior, and legal rights right around the 18th century when colonial use of slaves was expanding. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley notes that scientific ideas about physical appearance and racial difference in the 18th century were largely folk ideas used to justify already existent social norms. So as a result of a desire to perpetuate systems of exploitation, more and more distinctions were made about the supposed differences amongst races, primarily the differences of black people from their white counterparts. This evolution of race became more concretized after social structures of slavery were in place, and not before, and was solidified by the Enlightenment. Which brings us to our third question. How did the Enlightenment impact definitions of race? The Enlightenment was a period of primarily European thought and ideological development that saw the emergence of some key concepts that tie back into today's discussion. First, there was a push in scientific communities to categorize the natural world using reason and creating elaborate hierarchical systems that emphasize the similarities between different species and subgroups and the inherent differences amongst others, and race was fitted into this same mold. As European theorists looked to classify the world into scientific groupings, physical markers that were already established social norms through enslavement and genocide were ways that they sought to prove that this was the natural order and not a social construction. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who was a proponent of concepts like individual liberty and freedom for white men, or those he considered his peers, also made claims that black slaves required less sleep than their European counterparts to justify excruciatingly long and inhumane work hours. And Samuel Cartwright, who falsely claimed that drapetomania was a mental defect that caused enslaved black people to run away from slavery, as if wanting to escape a lifetime of enslavement was illogical? The Enlightenment formulation of history also played a crucial role in the development of social ideologies of race. Kant, Hegel, and other philosophers of their day claimed that certain racial groups stood outside of history or had no history, and this included all groups that they considered non-white or outside of European ideals of modernity. This meant that groups that were devoid of history and culture were inherently less valuable and therefore subordinate to other races, and they were cast as the natural sacrifices of progress. These assumptions were also codified into law in the 18th and 19th century. The first naturalization laws of the United States in 1790 limited naturalized citizenship to free white persons and excluded other groups. Children born of enslaved mothers were said to inherit the legal statuses of their mother, effectively keeping them in bondage perpetually. And Native Americans were often denied legal property rights, which helped to expedite the process of westward expansion across the North American continent. And anti-miscegenation laws were drafted in order to assure that people from different racial backgrounds did not intermarry or have children in order to protect ideals of racial purity. But these racial categorizations didn't always neatly align with skin tone. In his book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, historian Matthew Jacobson notes that in the US, white or Caucasian was not always considered a unified race composed of anyone of European descent. Whiteness was often considered exclusive to Anglo-Saxon descendants, while other European groups were broken into different ethnic categories such as Celt, Slavs, Iberics, and Hebrews, which were considered separate races from the 1840s to the early 20th century. But in the 1920s, when there was a stemming of immigration from Europe, these different races were subsumed into one category called whiteness to shore up a cultural majority against other racial groups and immigrants, and this persisted throughout the 20th century. So how does it all add up? Well, race started as a marker of kinship, but then we see it shift to become less about familial inheritance and more focused on physical indicators due to the rise of Enlightenment reasoning and labor exploitation. But where does that leave us today? Well, in the past several decades, scholars have noted both an uptick in identifying with your ethnic history, for example, pride in your country or culture of origin, instead of just being white or black, but we've also seen a revival of outdated theories of race being biologically determined and attached to certain traits, like considering all people of one physical type as prone to certain behaviors. But regardless of how people identify themselves, race continues to be a complex topic of discussion and debate. With that final thought in mind, do you have any other historical points to add to the evolution of race? And how has race been used in both positive and negative contexts throughout history? Definitely be sure to check out the works cited this week, since there was a lot of material and ground to cover, and this was only just the surface. Well, that's it for this week. Drop them below, like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.
And so actually, I'm going to ask if we can end the screen sharing again for a second, because I'd love to check in with y'all. Was there anything, and we'll only spend a little bit of time on this. This is largely just to give us a shared definition we're working out of so we can get to the solutions, which I know is what you all are really excited about. But was there anything in that video that struck you as interesting, struck you as frustrating, was new? Yeah, Celia.
Well, pardon me being, it's my background, but Jews were never really accepted anywhere and were always considered to be another race. And in Europe in particular, I believe, I know this is coming a little bit further ahead, but they've been murdered and slaughtered and enslaved forever. So that's about the only thing I would think that bothered me. It was all very enlightening, but that bothered me.
Yeah, the fact that Jewish people weren't white until they were, except when they're not. And that is very much the case throughout US history as well as European history. Thank you for raising that.
And that's even an issue in times like today, where we're seeing anti-Semitic vandalism and hate crimes in Lafayette. Sometimes folks in the Jewish community are considered the canary in the coal mine because we don't often recognize that anti-Semitism is one of the base theologies of white supremacy and white nationalism. And some people in the South continue to blame Jews for helping the civil rights movement be as successful as it was.
Thanks, Will.
Anyone else? Anything come up for you in that video?
The economics was strongly emphasized in that.
Yeah.
However, it's translated, I think, and always has been to begin with, a form of group narcissism that I'm better than you. And I think that operates somewhat independently of economics and underscores really every aspect of it. I think that narcissism is part of being human, perhaps an early stage, because we do normally get past it. But in groups, we tend to go back to it. And at those times, it's associated with casting out and perceiving the other as evil.
So help me out. Your name's not Deborah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're Deborah.
Yes, and my husband is Howard Wiseman.
Howard, that's right. You introduced us to him earlier. Thank you.
And if you can't tell, he's a psychiatrist.
Excellent. So Howard, if you'll forgive me for jumping in, what you're pointing to is a really important issue. And so if you remember, our definition of racism equals race prejudice plus institutional and systemic power. What you're talking about is the race prejudice part, and that is real. All of us get trained into race prejudice. All of us get trained into biases against groups that aren't ours. And we work really hard. I mean, organizations like I4C exist specifically because we want to transcend those biases. And that's a really important issue. And when we're talking about racism as distinct from race prejudice, that's where the economics comes in. And if you'll forgive me for, she doesn't talk about it in this video, but have any of you heard of Bacon's Rebellion?
No.
Francis Bacon?
No, different Bacon. So in 1676, 100 years before the formation of the United States as an independent nation, you heard in the video how she talked about white indentured servants had a hard life, and when their contract was over, they got their freedom, or even if they lived in indentured servitude their whole lives, their children were not indentured as well. That was one of the distinctions between indentured servants and enslaved people. However, their lives were both very hard. And in 1676, the landowners told the indentured servants and the enslaved folks on those plantations to go and get rid of all the Native Americans who kept making incursions onto their land and making life difficult. And in the process of doing that, the white indentured servants and the black enslaved people said, wait a second, the people who are really making our lives difficult are the plantation owners. And they staged a joint rebellion, white indentured servants and black enslaved people. Right around then is when quote unquote science, the fake science, the pseudoscience of race that she talks about in the video begins to emerge in this country, because the folks in charge realized, oh crud, if poor white folks and enslaved people get together, this game is over and we do not get to hold all of the stuff. And we like holding all of the stuff. So if we can set up all of these lies that pit them against each other so that they're not focused on us, we can keep holding on to the stuff. And they have for the next 400 years. You all know the economics of this country. They still have all the stuff and keep getting more of it. In the past 6 months, the concentration of wealth in a handful of pockets has grown bigger, while the rest of us are struggling more and more. So I think it's important to understand economics does play a very significant role in how race was constructed, specifically in this country, and specifically in response to certain things like wanting to generate wealth out of tobacco production and that needing lots of cheap labor, and therefore creating an entire fake science, the ramifications of which we still live with. And you may have noticed in that video that the rules keep changing. Who can be white, who can't? As Celia pointed out earlier, the rules change back and forth sometimes. And what has remained consistent across those hundreds of years has been the shutting out, the dehumanization of Black people, and the lie of the supremacy of white people, while the definition of who white people are has changed over those years. That's a lot of information to be dumping on you all at once. I usually spend days getting to this point, but y'all are so smart. I knew I could go fast with you. So thank you for that. Let's keep going with the slides just so I can get us through the definition and into the, so what do we do about this? Thanks for bearing with me. So I wanted to come back to institutions and systems are part of this definition. Faith communities, schools, banks, halls of government, those are all institutions. So when we say that the definition of racism equals race prejudice plus institutional and systemic power, these are institutions. Institutions exist to provide services to their members. They are not necessarily good, they are not necessarily bad, and we do need them. But when they start to function in ways that perpetrate racism, that becomes the problem. And when we talk about systems, go ahead and move to the next slide. When we talk about systems, that's how institutions work together. I wanted to share with you an issue that I know I4C cares about a great deal as an illustration of what a system is. You may have heard the term, the school to prison pipeline, and that's where daycares and schools and parole officers and the judicial system and the bail bondsman, all of these different institutions work together to create a system. And tragically, in this country, that system results in young, from the age of 3, disproportionate punishment of boys of color, brown and black boys in particular, for the same infractions that white children would participate in, and a growing gap in the level of punishment, leading ultimately to much higher rates of incarceration of brown and black youth, boys and men in particular, but of both genders, ending up pulled out of our school systems and put into juvenile justice or into the prison system. So that's an illustration of a system and how it functions out of racism. Let's move to the last slide because I want to talk about the one word we haven't gotten to yet, which is power. Now, in my fantasy world, when we talk about power, we'd be talking about the Incredible Hulk, all the muscles, all the strength. I sometimes wish that I had that level of power. But when we're talking about power in relationship to the definition of racism, what we really mean is access and control. So we've talked about prejudice and how that's just prejudging. We've talked about race and how it was constructed uniquely in this country. We've talked about what institutions and systems are, which are designed to serve their members. And I've mentioned that power is functionally access and control. When you put those things together, you're dealing with real racism. And that distinction is important because most of the conversations that happen in the world conflate racism and race prejudice. And part of that is because part of the unique United States version of racism is grounded in individualism. And so it gives the lie that racism can be solved by our individual acts, our individual compassion and kindness, erasing our bias, treating everyone the same. I wish that were true. And that is where faith communities spend most of our time, which makes sense because we want to create compassion and kindness in the world. We want to raise our children with those values. We want to extend that compassion to our neighbors. That interpersonal work is really important. But the sad thing is, because of the way race was shaped in this country over hundreds of years, even if every single one of us erased the race prejudice from our lives, if there was not a single person with race prejudice in this country, systemic racism would still exist. I'm going to say it one more time. Even if none of us had any race prejudice, systemic racism would still exist because it is baked into our codes, our laws, even our Constitution. And that's what makes it so important that we be honest about the way racism shows up in our institutions and systems if we're ever actually going to uproot it. And that's why this session is specifically on systemic racism and how to engage it. All right. You have every reason not to believe me about any of that, but I want to go ahead and share with you one more video before we get into a little more conversation to share one perspective on how systemic racism exists in this country. If you wouldn't mind, we'll move into that next video. I think that's the next thing. Yes.
Never underestimate the power of the people when they understand the message. Never underestimate that. I think that this is something that can be done quite quickly. I think it's something that can be done rather efficiently. It's just going to require a large enough parade. It's going to require a large enough people to understand the core concepts, and that's the real work that we have to do right now. Is hit that critical tipping point, which is probably around 20 or 30% of the voting populace actually understanding the issue.
And a big part of the issue when creating a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy movement is an understanding of how race and racism were constructed in the United States through law, and how those laws informed our culture in much the same way those corporate rights have been constructed through the law to ensure rule of the wealthy minority over the majority, and how our culture reinforces and legitimizes that lack of democracy. Right from the very beginning, Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution defined people as property. You see, the authors of the Constitution were very interested in protecting their property, including slaves. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. Indigenous communities are forced from their homelands. Over 10 years, 100,000 native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown arid territory. 15,000 do not survive the journey. But over 25 million acres of land is made available for white settlers. 1854, the People versus Hall. Non-whites are barred from testifying in court. No black, mulatto, or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Free blacks are taxed, but still have no rights of citizenship granted to whites. 1862, Emancipation Proclamation in District of Columbia. Slaves are freed in D.C., but former slave owners are reimbursed for slaves given up. Whites are paid over $1 million in reparations for lost property. 1862, Homestead Act. 50 million acres of formerly indigenous land in the West, having been violently invaded by U.S. soldiers in violation of treaties, is distributed by the government at low cost to white settlers only. And 100 million acres of indigenous land are given for free to railroad developers. 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act bans immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. 1924, Johnson-Reed Act creates an immigration quota system based on national origin, favoring Nordics over the inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe. 1934, in the wake of the Great Depression, the National Housing Act is implemented, creating a federal housing authority to provide loans and federal subsidies for home ownership, but the FHA mortgage underwriting standards discriminate against non-whites and investment in non-white communities through a process called redlining. 1942, an executive order forces 111,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps. And the war on drugs declared by Richard Nixon violently targets and imprisons people of color disproportionately through today.
Righteous anger can only be provoked by anger at injustice and our unfairness. And I'm angry about the fact that we've got 20 to 25% of the children in the richest country in the world who go to bed hungry or undernourished every night. I'm angry about the fact that we have transnational corporations that are destroying the planet that we depend upon for life itself. And I'm angry about the fact that the world that's being created with the rape and plunder of Mother Earth is a racist, sexist, and class oppressive society. You bet I'm angry. I'm angry because it doesn't have to be this way.
Are we in a class war right now?
Of course we are. And you know, Warren Buffett, I think, said it the clearest. He said, we're in a class war, and we've been in a class war for years, and my class is winning. And who is his class? The owning class, the people who own these corporations.
There's a lot in that video to process, and it ties to what I was talking about earlier related to systemic and institutional power and how it locks racism in place, even when none of us wants that to be the case. So we're moving to solutions. I promise this is going to end on a we can do it note. But before we get there, Will's going to move y'all into some small groups just to have a chance to talk through what's been coming up for you, how you're feeling about it, what information is new, and if you have the bandwidth, how you see it applying to your work with I4C.
Do you want to go 7 minutes, or should we go all the way till 8 o'clock?
Let's go, yeah. People deserve time to really process. I think you're right.
Okay, we'll try to bring everyone back at 8 o'clock, or we'll give you at least a notice a minute before that so that you can come back.
Sandhya, can you just repeat the very last part of what you were hoping
Yes.
to investigate?
Yeah, since you have enough time to get to that last one. How does this content relate to the work you want to do with I4C? Margaret, thank you for asking.
All right, here we go. Follow the links and the invitation to move to a different room.
And Will, I'm not going into a small group because I tend to throw off small groups when I go into them because they just want me to talk the whole time yeah. So I hope that doesn't throw off the numbers too much. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sounds good.
Okay, good.
We'll see you in a few.
All right. Oh, and if you want to pause the recording, because probably nobody needs to see us just sitting here for 10 minutes.
Myself.
Pause it. So
Good
friends,
catch. Yes, we're back.
excellent. So we're not going to spend a ton of time reporting back, but if there is anything that came up in your conversations that you wanted to share with a larger group, now's your chance. What came up as you were talking together, particularly that's relevant to the Interfaith Council, but whatever came up. Meg, did I see you unmute yourself?
Yes, I did. So I'm on the committee for developing a mentoring program for adjudicated youth. And so I really see that this is an opportunity for us to train mentors in a way that makes them perhaps makes them, because I don't want to assume they're not, but I think we really do want to look at racism, and we want to look at implicit bias, and we want to help our mentors to be sensitive to the cultural differences, because I'm assuming that many of our mentors may be white and many of our young people will be of color. And I want to make sure that I just see this as an opportunity to really open up the community in certain ways, even as they're serving these young people, just aside from being mentors, that it could open up the community to a whole lot of things that are very valuable.
Yeah.
Thanks, Meg. And Megan shared a bit about this this committee. It's called iChange.
Yes.
And it's working with Reverend Julius Van Hook and some of the young people he's been working with in juvenile hall. So you can talk to Meg or Margaret Niles or myself if you're interested in that committee.
That's
Go ahead,
great.
Shonda.
That's great. Anybody else want to share anything that came out of those conversations?
Well,
yeah.
Sandhya, these videos and just everything that you've said are just very powerful. And in our group, I just shared 2 more resources, and I'll put them in the chat room. But Race, the Power of the Illusion. It's offered in a lot of different platforms, but through the public library, through Canopy, you can get it. Just Faith Watches episode 2, which really highlights everything in your second one about the Homestead Act and all the acts. And then Bread for the World has a racial wealth gap simulation.
Yes.
That is really powerful for groups. I'll put that in the chat. Just go to Bread for the World and racial wealth gap simulation. And it uses a lot of things in your second video. It's an interactive, if you can, granted, it's now made for virtual, but I've facilitated it in person. It's a really good way for white people to see all of this because they have money and they have opportunities, and it's kind of like Monopoly. They lose it or they gain it depending on whether you're black or white. And obviously by the end of the simulation, the white people have all the money and all the opportunities.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Meg. That would be an amazing thing for you all to get to go through. I know Reverend Deb and I did a poverty simulation that had some racial components to it that caused a lot of anxiety in participants. It was really hard to confront some of that when we did that, I remember. So yeah, that's another way to do it. And I didn't realize they have a digital version of it. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks. Others, anything come up that you want to share before we move into, don't worry, there are things we can do.
Well, just an observation on that last observation about whites getting all the chips, winning the game of Monopoly. Whites have the capital. They have the material goods. They have the food. They have the housing. They have the loans you need. And people of color have the labor. They are hard workers and willing to work and capable of working. The problem is they can't outweight the people with the money. They have to get paid right now in order to eat. They have to get paid right now to pay the rent. They have to get paid right now to pay that deductible on their medical or whatever. And so they lose every time, even though labor needs capital and capital needs labor to have any kind of productive economy of any kind. Capital always wins against labor.
And we're seeing that. Well, I'm not going to get into the ballot initiatives right now. Sorry, I saw somebody's hand up. Yes, Celia.
Yeah, you mentioned something about the Japanese in World War II. That was not so much money, I think, even though people in the areas where they lived in Central California in particular prospered by, their incarceration, so to speak. But it was just as horrid as anything that's been done to almost anyone. I mean, they weren't murdered like the First Nations or treated like slaves, but there was, what would you call that? Is that institutional racism? What was done to the Japanese?
So it is institutional racism, but it is hard to separate it from the economics of it are not visible, but that doesn't mean they're not there. I think it's worth remembering the very first time Border Patrol was put along the Mexican border, it was to keep out cheap Japanese labor. Many of you who grew up here know that your parents will remember Japanese farm workers were very common prior to World War II. They were a cheap source of labor. And this country has a history of when we need cheap labor, we let the cheap labor come in. And when we need someone to demonize, we demonize the cheap labor.
Yeah.
So I think you all have probably made the point yourselves that virtually no Germans and virtually no Italians or people of German or Italian descent were incarcerated. Not saying none, there were dozens.
Yes.
But there were dozens in contrast with every single Japanese American, despite the fact that there were German and Italian Americans working for the other side, and there was not a single case of Japanese Americans doing so. And what's interesting about that particular moment is, yes, people profited from it. And it was connected to the cycle of cheap labor and then not needing the cheap labor. Chinese cheap labor was deeply valued until it wasn't. And as soon as Chinese cheap labor was devalued, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed here in California. California has a rich history of letting in cheap Asian labor and then demonizing Asians when they don't need the labor anymore. We've got a very long history of it. And this was one illustration. It's much more subtle, but it's still driven by economics. It's just not obviously driven by economics. I'm so glad you brought that up.
But the Indigenous genocide wasn't subtle.
Right.
We paid people $5 a head, and people were killing anyone whose hair passed as Native American. They were getting scalped for the money.
Wow. And it's not the same subject. When Jews got out of concentration camp and went back to Poland to move where they lived in their homes, thousands were murdered.
Absolutely.
Thousands. So we're a very complicated animal.
Absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And what is common across the world is people with power manipulate everyone else in order to retain power. So I've said this is very focused on the US by design, because the way racism manifests in different countries is shaped by their histories, just like ours. But the thing that is consistent is people with power want to retain power and create constructs that preserve their power at the expense of the rest of us. So tell you what, we don't have tons of time, and I want to leave a little more time for conversation at the very end. And I did promise that this was going to be what we can do. Now, y'all can see we spent an hour and 10 minutes just talking about the definition of racism. It's an illustration of how deep and complex this is. If I do a day-long training, we spend an hour and a half just talking about the definition and doing exercises where we start out by saying what each of us thinks the definition of racism is. And if I'm doing a training of 100 people, we have 100 definitions. We can hone them down to maybe 5 or 6, but that's part of what makes this work so difficult. And so just having some shared language and shared analysis puts you miles ahead of the rest of the country on this subject. So I hope it felt like time well spent to you, because I think it's important to move us to this next bit, which is there are things we can do. And I've got 2 slides full of these, so I'll send the next steps along to you through Will. Absolutely, it's great to do book groups. Some of my friends of color have joked that in the wake of George Floyd's murder, they have learned that white people love nothing quite so much as they love a book group. I don't have any problem with book groups as long as they are pointing us towards what we do after we've learned the thing we've learned. I think book groups are a great starting place. They are not a good ending place. So please read all the books and make sure your last conversation is, so what are we going to do about it? Because that's where the exciting work happens. Self-reflection is fine and really important. I think that the work we do around unconscious bias matters. I think the work we do around microaggressions, the millions of tiny little things that people of color have to endure on a daily basis, I think it's important to address those things. They are usually not intentionally connected to systemic change, and that's a shame. So when you do your self-reflection work, that's great. Make sure you're paying attention not just to the ways we've all been trained into our biases, but make sure it's also connecting you with all these systems that benefit from us being pitted against each other, and starting to think about how to change that. People often want to do something more than donate, but donating matters. Donating to the Movement for Black Lives, to the Black Visions Collective, to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, depending on which community you're in, that has is doing great work right now. Reclaim the Block. The National Bail Fund makes sure that particularly Black protesters over the past 6 months have been getting out on bail, which positions them much better to win their cases. Investing in Know Your Rights campaigns for immigrant communities and Black communities. It can be scary to figure out where to show up at a protest. I know I4C does some protesting and it's tricky to navigate right now, but there are some great tools on how to show up for protests safely and well. And I'm going to post in the chat box an article from Time Out magazine that really has some great instructions on how to show up safely for a protest, but you don't have to. Let's go ahead. Do you mind? Oops. Do you mind moving us back to the slide? Because I was able to post it in the chat box. I'm just going to get through the bullet points on the slides, and then we'll move to large group conversation. And yes, there is a list of organizations you can donate to that I will post as well. Are you having a little bit of a technical?
You're muted, Will.
Ah, thank you.
Can you see this yet? Hold on a
We
sec.
can see a Word document.
It's not letting me find the keynote. Hold on a sec. Here we go. There we go.
Excellent. And so actually the article that I posted, the Time Out article, has links to the organizations you can donate to as well. I actually sent the article to my mother back in June because she said, "What do I do?" And I sent her that article. And then we watched the documentary 13 together about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And afterwards I said, "What did you think about that movie?" And she said, "It made me really proud of the fact that I donated to the National Bail Fund." So go back one slide really quickly. Sorry, Will.
Wait, thank you.
Yeah. So if you are looking for a way to show up at a protest, one of the organizations, there's a network that emerged after the 2016 election in the Bay Area called Bay Resistance. And they have organized, still not ready for the next one yet, I'm sorry. Will, if you don't mind going back one more time, I apologize.
Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. So Bay Resistance is, in fact, they are organizing a day after the election series of events to make sure that regardless of what happens on Tuesday, November 3rd, that we have access to the resources we need moving forward. Something as simple as signing a petition. I have a number of friends who, after the 2016 election, said, "I commit to doing one thing a day." And sometimes that thing will be going to a protest. Sometimes it'll be donating money. But I can also use the website ResistBot, which is also on Facebook, which is also something you can do by text. And you can write to your elected officials every time you read something in the newspaper and say, "Oh, that's racist. Oh, that border wall," or "Oh, that that legislation that's trying to disenfranchise Black people is horrible." It is very easy to use the system that ResistBot has set up that automatically sends letters to your congresspeople, your senators, your governor, the president, depending on who you want to contact. Really simple way to join. I strongly encourage the voting and the recruitment of additional voters. There's an organization called Seed the Vote that connects people with phone banking on behalf of people of color-led grassroots organizations in battleground states. That organization is called Seed the Vote. And many of my friends are working with them because you're not just working for a candidate, you're helping build the strength of these people of color-led grassroots organizations in the process. And they have a great process to make sure that you can phone bank without being terrified of it. They do a great job. If you happen to be on social media, share voices of color, amplify voices of color. If you follow people who really are speaking truth, don't necessarily steal their ideas, but share them and attribute who you're getting that wisdom from, so that you're normalizing the fact that we learn from people of color. Support Black and people of color creators and business owners. Keep listening and learning. Go ahead and move to the next slide now. So I don't know that this is whether this is a social media crowd. I think you're a very diverse group, so some of you are. I have found that Black Twitter is one of the best things in my life. I am on Twitter largely to follow Michael Harrington. I think there are amazing Indigenous and Black and Asian and Latinx voices on Twitter that are really making my life better. And some of my colleagues recently said Indigenous TikTok is their favorite thing out there. So you literally look for the hashtag Indigenous TikTok and you'll find amazing things.
Native TikTok is amazing.
Yes, thank you. Yes, both. That's right. I even used something from a friend of mine sent me a TikTok video that we used as our land acknowledgement at the last Oakland Peace Center gathering. It was beautiful. Plug into existing campaigns in your community. There's often a temptation to launch new things when we learn about these horrors. And in an area like this, there are people already doing the work. There are people from impacted communities already doing the work. If you get fired up about an issue, look for the people working on that issue and connect with them. You don't have to start something from scratch. Particularly paying attention to supporting Black, Indigenous, and other people of color-led movements. Pay attention to what's happening in the schools you went to. How can you influence the school to prison pipeline where you and your friends have voice? Alumni are profoundly influential. In Oakland, the Black Organizing Project was able to pass the George Floyd Memorial Amendment to remove funding from police in the Oakland public schools and move it to social services, social workers in the public schools to resource the youth the ways they needed to be resourced. And that campaign was driven by Oakland Public High School alumni and current students. It was a 10-year campaign. They worked for a long time on it. But the fact that they said, we are from these schools, we have lived with the negative effects of this, really transformed things. Alumni have a lot of power. Learn whose land you're on, acknowledge it, and seek ways to partner with Indigenous people. If you don't know whose land you're on, there is an amazing project called Land Back. And if you text your zip code to this number that I'm typing into the chat box, and I'll say it out loud for those of you watching at home. If you type your zip code and text it to 907-312-5085, they will text you back who lived or still lives on that land and who it originally belonged to. And some of my friends who have done that work have realized, oh, we have some reparations to make with the people who used to live on this land or who are living on this land but no longer are allowed to claim it as their own. We do Indigenous land recognition at the beginning of every Oakland Peace Center meeting, and part of what we do is commit to deepening our relationship with our Indigenous siblings here in the Bay Area, because they're not gone. They're still here. They're still fighting. And we have the unique opportunity to join with them in that work and learn from and follow them in that work of land rematriation, as Karina Gold puts it. figure out how to show up for your non-citizen, and I'm sorry I said classmates, but your non-citizen, I meant colleagues. I apologize. Figure out how to show up for your non-citizen colleagues right now, because the laws keep changing. The instability of our current context is terrifying. Extend love and compassion to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in all the ways that we are showing up and can't show up, because this is such a traumatizing period. Figure out where to support each other and where it's actually helpful to show up on each other's behalf. That's lots of listening, that's lots of talking, that's lots of relationship building work. And obviously, as I already said, vote. I think a lot about John Lewis saying, if our vote didn't matter, they wouldn't keep trying to take it away from us. And last but not least, and I'm going to ask Will to move to this final slide, and I apologize, I don't love doing commercials, but I did just launch a 6-week course on the stuff that we just talked about over the course of this last hour. If you are interested in going deeper into some of this material for your personal journey, you are welcome to sign up for that course. I've just posted the link to it in the chat box. That has us at time. We could take a few more questions or comments or reflections or how this applies to I4C. And then I'll let Will wrap us up. Yeah. Myrtle. Oh, sorry. I saw Myrtle first and then Channing. I apologize.
Okay. That's okay. Murdell, just could you repeat the...
Murdell, I apologize.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the organization, the Indigenous Land?
Yes. So there's a number that I have posted in the chat box. I'm just posting it again.
Okay.
And if you text your zip code to that phone number, they will respond with a text telling you whose land you are on. It's a remarkable process. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to do that in the past couple of minutes, but
there's some websites that do it and actually show. Yeah. It doesn't show some of the Native American tribes that have that don't exist anymore. I live on Patwin land here, and they have kind of a bad reputation because they became mercenaries for General Vallejo in the town of Vallejo next door to Benicia. So they're not often counted by some of these sites, but they are by some of the ones that show the actual areas. But there's overlap between many of them because a lot of these different lands were used seasonally. You know, if you're in Concord or even parts of Walnut Creek, part of it is Bay Miwok and part of it is Ohlone.
Yeah. And Channing, go ahead, and then Margaret.
Sure. So I think these are all wonderful things, but I think that we have so much healing to do. I mean, so much healing to do. It's overwhelming. And I think doing these things takes a step in the area of feeling that we're helping to correct the situation.
Yeah.
What I'm waiting for is I read a while ago that Barbara Lee was going to start a reconciliation project.
Yeah.
Has anyone heard anything about that? So, you know, I didn't see her following up with it. So I think that that's what we need in this country. In South Africa, Reverend Tutu, you know, organized reconciliation throughout the country, and they did it on a massive scale.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think let's just start small, and we need to heal, you know?
Yeah.
Learning what you've presented today is the most important thing. And Will has brought many programs to I4C with the ING network and so forth. And we've gone over the colonialization and so forth.
Yeah.
But this is the first step. But I think the next step is really to figure out how we're going to work together to heal the divide between us.
Yeah.
And that's what I would like to participate in.
So Channing, I really appreciate you saying that, and I think if you'll indulge me, I've got a chapter in my last book specifically on a truth commission process. One of the things that people learned from South Africa was truth and reconciliation was too much to do in one step. And most of the folks who were a part of that have changed their strategies to a truth commission. For exactly what you've said, we need to get at the truth if we're going to get at reconciliation. I also, and you all get to figure this out for yourselves because I live in Alameda County, so I don't get a vote in this. I increasingly say we can't do reconciliation until we've done reparations.
I agree. I had that written down too.
I believe it. Yeah.
Trying to go hand in hand.
They do. Mm-hmm.
And you know how much we're struggling with reparations politically.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm just trying to figure, I just think that the healing has to be our focus. It has to go very deep in us individually in terms of our understanding, not only of the history of what's happened in this country, but what is going on today in exponential forms. So we need to start somewhere.
I really, really appreciate that. And I think 400 years of broken promises means we're going to need to see the proof before we can trust the reconciliation. So yeah, I really value what you're bringing into that conversation.
I put the link for the Sagoriate Land Trust in the chat room as well. And I'm going to put all of these links and even all of the what to do into the YouTube description with this presentation and the link to Reverend Jha's upcoming class as well. So if you don't get everything out of there now, just go to the YouTube channel afterward and you'll be able to find all of these links and all of this text.
Oh, thanks for doing that work, Will. Thank you. Margaret, was that who was next?
Yeah, and it's 8:31, so I don't mind handing it back to you if that makes your world easier. I've never said anything that important.
I feel like everything I've heard you say has been really important.
So the one thing I wanted to say is that this work is really hard for white people, and it's overwhelming, and we get tired, and we're like, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. Some days, some weeks, and I just want in the mindset of what you've taught us tonight is to acknowledge in those moments that Black people don't get to decide that they're tired of talking about this. And Indigenous people and, you know, people who are legacies or generations down from some of these communities that we've described, they don't get to put it away. And that's not to say shame on us. It's just to say, it's just a visceral experience of the difference between having privilege and not having privilege. And so I just, in that vein, I say, reach out to us, you know, to each other. Like we need to help each other and be there for each other and have patience and compassion and love and all those things. So it's not an admonishment. It's just a reminder that we have, even in doing this work, we have a lot of privilege, and I would be remiss if I didn't point it out.
Thanks a lot. And thanks to all of you for everything you've shared. It's really been powerful. It's really been beautiful. I'm excited for what this means for you all, for what you all have been creating and are going to continue to create. And thank you for letting me be a part of it. Will, you going to send us out?
Thank you.
Of course. And so we've received our marching orders from Reverend Sandhya Jha that we are to put on our cultural and religious anthropology hats in addition to our faith hats and our faith lenses, to be able to learn and be able to recognize the intersectionalities between all of these different systems, between the laws and the cultural norms and the taboos and all of those different portions. And so we want to thank Reverend Jha for a wonderful night. And if you want to do sign language for clapping in a way that we can share that with her, we can do that even as a group here and let her see our thanks. And we're planning on bringing you back, hopefully in conversations with our next trainer, who is Fresh Lev White, who's going to be leading a training on self-compassion and how to have compassion for ourselves as we do this work so that we can be in it for the long haul. That's going to be November 18th. It's also a Wednesday night at 7 p.m. and that will also be recorded. And Fresh Lev White is also going to do an implicit bias training, which is a longer time. It'll be a 2.5-hour training, January 31st. So save that Sunday afternoon at 2:30. Sunday, January 31st, and then we're hoping in February to have both Reverend Sandhya Jha and Fresh Lev White in a panel conversation to be able to go a little deeper about all the things that we're hearing and learning, and continue to be able to sharpen our own swords as we do the work that we're called to do as people of faith. And so thank you again, Reverend Jha. We just really appreciate you. And especially all the work in preparation for getting us here to this place tonight. This was one of those missing conversations that we haven't been able to have, but we're so grateful also to the Lesher Foundation for giving us the funds with which to pay a decent honorarium to our trainers and to be able to be here together as well. Thank you and have a great night.